The Stickiest Gecko, part of a speculative story which is about current geckos and selective breeding. It was the Gecko Olympics. An alien race had a long tradition of selective breeding that permeated their history. Even in the midst of genetic engineering, this tradition prevailed due to its cultural significance. When the aliens first travelled to Earth, they collected organisms in hopes to experiment. One fascination of the aliens were Gecko's sticky feet. The aliens bred geckos for their microscopic adhesive hair-like setae. The aliens over time manipulated gecko setae length, the density of setae, and the amount the setae branched into the smaller hairs called spatulae. The aliens also may have sometimes manipulated the number of toe pad ridges called lamellae. Some of the geckos ended up with relatively huge feet and toes seemingly impractical to evolve naturally. One fascination was with breeding geckos which originally had hairs not much different to shorter hair-like structures on geckos called spinules. Early on, the aliens bred cave geckos which originally had hair-like structures, shorter than some gecko setae, but with a little bit of branching on the forefeet. Generation by generation, the aliens bred these geckos for longer hair-like structures, at a higher degree of branching and flatter toes, with a higher surface area in contact with the surface. Other experiments were carried out on Gonatodes geckos, a genus intermediate between some geckos with and without adhesive toe pads. The aliens presumably had organisms on their own planet with adhesive hair-like structures, but they had utterly exhausted the possibilities and now sought a fresher challenge. The Gecko Olympics was a momentous occasion and a chance to showcase the breeders' geckos and determine whose geckos had the most adhesive feet. Surfaces harder and harder for geckos to stick to were used, and the geckos stuck to the hardest surface to stick to won. In conjunction, the aliens also sometimes hung weights from the geckos to see which geckos could support the most weight. Chameleons have friction-enhancing structures on their feet, and the aliens were undertaking the challenge of breeding for chameleons with adhesive feet. To select which geckos to breed with, the aliens had to peer through microscopes in the patient but to them fulfilling experience of examining the hair-like structures. Some breeders had hopes of a gecko with furry feet or completely furry, but such a feat, pun not intended, seemed far off. Geckos' hair-like structures weren't the only reason they were bred. The Persian spider gecko, an animal with elongated legs, was bred for longer, more spider-like legs. There was, however, a dark side to the aliens. They cared about curiosity at the expense of the geckos. Inbreeding was rampant. Relatively huge feet came with health issues, and to some, the weight of geckos' large eyes and heads were considered a hindrance to adhesion, with some lines of geckos being bred for smaller heads and much smaller, less sensitive eyes. The geckos were kept in minute lockers. The geckos needed help. Would it ever come? Thanks. I hope you enjoyed.